We're studying in Zechariah, the 11th chapter, and last week we were talking about verse 12, and I want to go back to it to kind of lead us into the rest of the chapter. Hopefully we'll finish chapter 11 today, give Bill a clean start on. That's right, I got another week. So maybe I can finish 12 and get you a fresh start on 13 and 14. But anyway, Zechariah here was doing some pretty heavy prophecy, and as we briefly talked last week, it's pretty obvious here that there's a reference to Jesus talking here about the pieces of silver, and we'll kind of move on from that, and maybe see some more of the prophecy and things that maybe even still extend into today. So before we go any further, I'd like for Keith Davis, if he would, lead our minds in prayer.
We come unto you, righteous Father, thanking you for this opportunity to gather here together and to study your word. We pray, Father, you will be with David as he presents a lesson unto us. May we be receptive, Father, of what he teaches, and we be able to use it to be better servants for you. We thank you for your Son, Jesus, his death on the cross that saves us. And it's through his name we pray. Amen.
All right, so let's look back at verse 12. It says, "And I said to them, if it is good, give me my price, and if not, let it go. So they weighted my price 30 pieces of silver." So since Zechariah was basically terminating his protection of the flock, he asked basically for him to have his wages paid. But if they refused to, then for them to just keep what they owed him. And he was concerned about making the flock feel that he had done what he is supposed to do than the money. In other words, it was better that they thought that he was doing a good job that in his mind than it was for them to pay. So they weighted out the sheep at 30 shekels of silver as he's paid. And of course, in Exodus 21 and 32, this is discussed. This is the price that if somebody's ox gores a servant or a manservant or a maidservant, then the owner of the ox has to pay the owner of the slaves 30 shekels of silver, and then of course the ox would have to be stoned. So basically what they're saying here is basically Zechariah is not worth any more than a slave, and really for the job that a shepherd does and all the work that a shepherd has to do, this isn't a whole lot of pay for the services that he's rendering. And their act was kind of shamelessly insulting to the things that Zechariah had done. Of course, this is kind of in a dream. This actually didn't really transpire. So they were basically offering him this wage was far worse than simply the outward rejection of it. They were insulting him with the amount of money that they were offering. Now, the reference to Jesus here in Matthew 26 and 15, it says, "And he said to them, what will you give me, and I will betray him to you? And they appointed him 30 pieces of silver." So, Judas was in the mindset that he was going to betray Jesus, and he basically asked the Jews, "Well, what's he worth to you?" And they gave him 30 pieces of silver. So in essence, what they were saying then was what they were saying to Zechariah now is, you're basically worth as much as a slave, and really a dead slave at that, because this was a tradition that had been well established in Leviticus. So this response shows how unworthy the people were of his solitude and all the work that he had done on their behalf, and they were ignoring the things that that Zechariah had said and was trying to do for them, because he was truly concerned about what was going to happen to him. Comments about that verse? All right, let's move on to verse 13. And Jehovah said to me, throw it to the potter, the magnificent price at which I was valued by them. And I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them to the potter in the house of Jehovah. So the Lord instructs Zechariah to throw these 30 pieces of silver to the potter. And this was done, in kind of a sarcastic manner. He talked here about a magnificent price. It wasn't a magnificent price. There was some sarcasm there in, the words of the Lord there, that, basically, it wasn't worth what they gave to you. So his servant had been his service had been obviously worth a whole lot more than that. So Zechariah threw the 30 pieces of silver to the potter in the temple. So that gives us a clue here to what the setting of this revelation was. Zechariah was there in the temple, or the area around the temple, and probably in the courtyard is where this, in his mind he was at. So throwing something at the potter was evidently a proverbial way of expressing disdain, since the potters were typically poor and lowly craftsmen. And when I was reading this and some of the commentaries, what came back to my mind was back when George W. Bush was the president, and they were doing a news conference over in Saudi Arabia or someplace like that, and one of the journalists threw a shoe at him. And they were talking about, what an insult that was, but not only did he throw one shoe at him, he threw both shoes at him. So, this was something even today, that throwing something back at somebody is a form of insult. So, we can see here that, some of these things that, we read about here, even in the Old Testament, has followed through, even today in the traditions of the people at that time. Now, it's kind of interesting that he mentions the potters here, because these potters were closely connected with the temple, since there was always a continual need for sacred vessels. Now, in Leviticus 6:28, it's talking about some sacrifices and things along that line. And in verse 28 it says, but the earthen vessels wherein is boiled shall be broken, and if it be boiled in brazen, it shall be scoured and rinsed in water. So there was a lot of pots and earthen vessels that were used in the worship service, and once it was used, pretty much it was unclean, and it was supposed to be broken and thrown out and not used for anything else. So obviously, there was going to be a need for a potter to continually make these pots for the worship and in the temple. But even though there was a demand for it, it was typically a low craft as far as that goes, and the potters were not very well paid, and they were on the craftsman totem pole. They were pretty much down there near the bottom. Now also, the fulfillment of the prophecy in Matthew in chapter 27 verses 3 through 10 is proof enough that the money was flung down in the temple and immediately taken up by the priest to purchase a field of potter for bearing ground for the poor. So obviously this is a prophecy of things to come, and it's talking about what's going to happen to Jesus. So if we go into Matthew the 27th chapter and start with verse 3 and read some verses here, we can basically see the same thing. So starting with verse 3, it says, then he who betrayed him, seeing that he was condemned, sorrowing, Judas returned the 30 pieces of silver again to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned, betraying innocent blood. And they said, what is that to us? You see to that. And he threw the pieces of silver down in the temple and departed, and he went and hanged himself. And the chief priest took the silver pieces and said, "It is unlawful to put them into the treasury, because it is the price of blood." And they took counsel and brought the potter's field with them to bury strangers in. Therefore, that field was called the field of blood to this day. Then that which was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled, saying, "They took 30 pieces of silver and the price of him who had been priced, whom they of the children of Israel valued." And then verse 10 it says, "And gave them for the potter's field as the Lord appointed me." Now Matthew here appointed this prophecy to Jeremiah, and especially there in verse 9, that's all, and verse 10, that's kind of almost a verbatim. So, probably Matthew was referring to Jeremiah 32, 6 through 9, which he kind of condensed, and he used the phraseology that, Zechariah was using here in verses 12 and 13, because it was similar to the situation of Judas. Now, the scholars say that joining or putting these quotations of two books in the Old Testament was not an unusual thing in the writings of the apostles, where there were several similar references, and you have two notable prophets, and you just pick one of them, so you just kind of work it all in there together. And an example of this would be another example would be in Mark 1, 2, and 3, in which Isaiah and Malachi are quoted, but are assigned, it's assigned to Isaiah. And if you look at those, Isaiah was talking about, he said, "The voice of one that crieth, prepare ye in the wilderness the way of Jehovah, and make level in the desert a highway for our God." And then Malachi says, "Behold, I send a messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom ye seek will suddenly come in his temple, and the messenger of the covenant whom ye desire, behold, cometh Jehovah of hosts." So it's not unusual in the New Testament to have something like that, because there are some people point to that to say, well, that's a fallacy, that's not what really happened, and when they're trying to say that the things in the Bible are not true. So these 30 pieces of silver were literally a goodly price that were paid, and whom they, the children, that's pretty much what the children of Israel, valued the work that Zechariah did. So in this situation and in this dream, the potter was literally the recipient of the money, and as it purchased money for the exhausted field for an unclean purpose. So there's a definite parallel here about Jesus and the things that Zechariah is talking about. Comments about that verse. All right, let's look at verse 14. "Then I broke my other staff union apart, that I might break the brotherhood between Judah and Israel." So Zechariah then symbolically broke his second staff, which, if you'll remember, we were talking about these staffs he had given a name. So this one was union, indicating the end of the unity that bound the Jews together. So just before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D., the Jews broke up into parties that were hostile to one another. There was a wedge that was driven in between the people there, and of course this condition was accelerated their destruction by the Romans, because basically they split their defense in two, and it was stronger as one, but when they broke it in two, it just made it easier for the Romans to go through and do what they wanted to do. So the order of the events is significant, and it was historical, the breaking of God's favor on his people, their rejection of the shepherd, and then the breaking of their unity. So we see here, Zechariah is absolutely prophesying about, about Jesus and what was going to happen, several hundred years later. So we know that the destruction will not be permanent. However, because of other promises that God will reunite and restore his people, and that he will not cast them off permanently. And all the way through, in our studies, we've talked about man gets away from God, God punishes man, man repents, God takes him back into favor, and it's the same pretty much with the Jews. But in the end, he united his people in a little bit different way than the Jews thought that it was going to happen. So the responsibility for human chaos pretty much lies squarely on the shoulders of humans, because God is always, justified and keeps all the promises that he makes. It's man who's the one who strays away from the center line, as it were, because God is always, straight down the middle. So God has offered men his shepherd, but they have rejected him to their own irreparable loss. And we know now that after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Romans, then there was a real problem there, and the Jews were never able to recover. Comments about that verse? All right, so now let's look at the last couple of verses here. And this is talking about the appearance of the bad shepherd in verses 15 through 17. So the full fate of Israel is not recounted in the rejection of the good shepherd raised up to tend them. God provided them with a good shepherd. The tale here of woe centers in their acceptance of a bad shepherd, and God, this bad shepherd was against God's will, so he was going to raise up and destroy the children of Israel. So let's look at verse 15. And Jehovah said to me, take to yourself yet the instruments of a foolish shepherd. So the Lord here next directs Zechariah to present himself as a foolish, and in the original text, I think the word was more worthless rather than foolish. Somebody who was morally deficient, but yet it was a shepherd, and he was going to shepherd his flock, but his motive in shepherding this flock was not the good of the flock, but the good of the shepherd. So we're talking about somebody who's exactly the opposite of what a good shepherd would be. And he's basically going to take the same instruments, but it's going to be the instruments of a foolish or a worthless shepherd. So let's look at verse 16. For lo, I will raise up a shepherd in the land who will not care for those going to ruin, nor will he seek the young, nor will heal that which is broken, nor will he feed that which stands, but he shall eat the flesh and the fat and tear off their hooves. So in this new role, Zacharias is going to be represented as one who fails to do for the shepherd all that a good shepherd would do. This is somebody who is completely the opposite of a watchful and good shepherd. This is one that's pretty much going to be self-serving and using the flock for his own benefit, not looking over the flock to take care of it. So, one of the things that we see here is Israel's preference for Barnabas over Jesus showed her, the willingness and many years later to accept a bad individual in place of a good one. The Jews had the opportunity and to select Jesus and save him from the cross. Of course, that was not how God was going to have it, but it was a choice that they made. God knew what was going to happen, but they still made that choice. And I think that we all recognize that Barnabas was not the greatest guy in the world. He had a lot of issues, but yet they picked somebody who was just an absolute scumbag over Jesus. So when one removes not from the sentence, he has an enlightened description of a truly effective pastoral ministry in the church today. So we're seeing a contrast here. So instead of caring for the lost, then this shepherd is caring for himself, and he's not looking to do any good at all. He's not seeking the young. He's seeking the ones that are scattered. If the sheep are injured, he's not worried about taking care of that, and he's not worried about feeding the healthy or the unhealthy. So we see here the tearing off of hoofs of the sheep probably represents the extremely greedy shepherd searching for the last edible morsel that he can extract from his charges whom he's consumed. So he's completely, just like a complete glutton, trying to get every little morsel of meat off of the bone in this situation. So we see here that somebody is pretty worthless and pretty self-serving in this situation. Comments about that verse? All right, let's move on to verse 17. Woe to the worthless shepherd who abandons the flock. The sword shall be on his arm and his right eye. His arm shall be completely dried up, and his right eye shall be utterly darkened. So God here is pronouncing judgment on the worthless shepherd for abandoning his flock. And this condemnation applies to all the evil kings of Israel and Judah who let their people down, but probably there's one particular individual in view. When the children of Israel went to the kings, they weren't very lucky when it came to getting good kings. Most of them were scoundrels, and but this kind of indicates that there's one that's more scoundrelous than others.
There are also problems with the priesthood too.
Absolutely.
There were corrupt priests. There were priests that were more political than spiritual. That was a problem. And of course, remember this time here, a couple hundred more years down the road, we're going to have the Herod family as kings. So that, and of course, they were no prizes either.
Right. So God here is going to paralyze this man's power. This is talking about his arm. And he's going to nullify his intelligence, which is kind of represented here by the eye. And basically, he's going to render him incapable of hurting others or defending himself. He's going to completely destroy. So that kind of leads to the question of, who is this bad shepherd? And there's a lot of it. It's not revealed to us, but obviously, this prophecy that is given here is going to come true somewhere further down in history, and there's a lot of candidates for this particular job. So some of the scholars and people who have really studied this and are really good students of Jewish history seem to think that part of this fulfillment was a guy named Bar Kokhba, and he led the ineffective Jewish revolt against the Romans in AD 132 to 135. And in that day, there was some that hailed him as the Messiah in this case. Now there's others that see this fulfillment in all those leaders of Israel who under the guise of shepherds misled and harmed the poor flock. Even in Zechariah's day, there was ones who were doing this, especially since the time that the nation has rejected Christ. However, the ultimate fulfilling, some scholars seem to think, is some type of antichrist, which, there was an antichrist referred to, and we studied this in the Revelation, who will make who will make a covenant with the Jews, and then he goes along good for a while, and then he basically breaks it and proceeds to to persecute the Jews. A couple of references here that we can kind of look at that the scholars seem to tie into this. In Ezekiel 34 and 2 through 4, it says, "Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say unto them, even to the shepherds, Thus saith the Lord Jehovah, Woe unto the shepherds of Israel who do feed themselves, should not be the shepherds that feed the sheep. Ye eat the fat, and ye clothe you with wool. You kill the farlings, but ye feed not the sheep. The diseased have ye not strengthened, neither have ye healed that which was sick, neither have ye bound up that which was broken, neither have ye brought back that which was driven away, neither have ye sought that which was lost, but with the force and with the vigor have ye ruled over them." So we see here that Ezekiel is talking about the same type of ruler, the same type of shepherd that's worthless and is not doing the things necessary to take care of his flock. Daniel also has a reference to this in Daniel 9 and 27, and it says, "And he shall make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week shall he cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and upon the wings of abomination shall come one that maketh desolate even unto the full end, and determined shall wrath be poured upon the desolate." So we're talking about the same here. Somebody that comes in and makes a bunch of promises, the people go along with it, and right in the middle of the deal, he goes in and basically abandons everything that he does. So, it could be a specific leader here, or it could be just the collective leadership of Israel from Zechariah's time all the way through, the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. So the judgment here in verse 17 brings to a close a cycle of prophecy which began with judgment back in chapter 9, verse 1. And the judgment has gone from the nations to center on Israel, and Zechariah is going to reveal the blessings of the nation and the condemnation of the nations all the way into the end of the book in verse or chapter 14. So, this is kind of the climactic scene of the first prophetic burden that's described in this the first part of the book, and then it's going to kind of change things in later on in chapter 12 chapter 12 and through chapter 14. So this kind of opens up, this section kind of sets the stage for the things that are going to happen in chapter 12 and chapter 14. So I'm going to kind of get off the subject here just a little bit in the last little bit of time we got left, and I found a real nice, concise talking about the Great Revolt. And we've talked about this a little bit, and there's a lot of the scholars that seem to point to some of the things that Zechariah is talking about here about the Great Revolt, which started in the year 66, and it originated in the Roman and the tensions between the Jews and the Romans. So this crisis kind of escalates due to the anti-taxation protests that the Jews were holding against the Roman, and they were starting to attack Roman citizens. And if you'll remember, when we were studying in Acts, Paul was a Roman citizen, and there were several occasions where that the Jews had attacked Paul, and if you remember, they whipped him a couple times, or more than a couple times. And when they found out he was a Roman citizen, the tune changed, because that was something that absolutely the Jews were not, the Jews were not permitted to do. So they were starting all these attacks. So the Romans responded by plundering the Jewish temple and executing up to 6,000 Jews in Jerusalem. And what this did is this prompted a full-scale rebellion. So the Roman military garrison of Judea was quickly overrun by some rebels, while the pro-Roman king Agrippa II, together with the Roman officials, they fled Jerusalem. And as it became clear the rebellion was getting out of control, Gaius, the governor of Syria, brought the Syrian army in, and he brought in one of the legions. It was the 12th Roman Legion, and reinforced the troops that were there to basically bring order to the revolt that was being had. So despite some initial advances in the conquest of Jaffa, the Syrian legion was ambushed and defeated by the Jewish rebels in a famous battle called the Battle of Beth Horon, where 6,000 Romans were massacred, and the legion Aquila was pretty much lost. And the result of that, this was a pretty big shock to the Roman leadership. So later in Jerusalem, there was an attempt by Menachem ben Yada, the leader of the group, to take control of the city, but it failed. And he was executed with the remaining group of his people who were ejected from the city. So another Jewish leader group, was raised here. And this guy, they say, was a very charismatic but very radical peasant named Simon Bar Goria, and he was expelled by the new Judean government, and the Jews began to reinforce the city. And then Yosef ben Menatu was appointed the rebel commander in Galilee, and Eleazar ben Hanai was the commander in Edom. And the experienced and unassuming general Vespasian, we talked about him a little bit last week, was given a task to crush this rebellion in the Judean province. Now, Vespasian was a very good Roman leader, and his son was Titus, and his son was appointed to be the second in command. So he was given 4 legions, and he was also assisted by the forces of King Agrippa. So what Vespasian did was he invaded Galilee in 67 AD. So to avoid direct contact with the reinforced city of Jerusalem, which was defended by the main Jewish or rebel force here, the Romans launched a persistent campaign to eradicate rebel stronghold and to punish the population. They were kind of working the edges to get ready to attack. So within several months, Vespasian and Titus had took over the major Jewish strongholds of Galilee, and finally overran Jodapas, which was under the command of one of the Jewish leaders, and there was a 47-day siege there. And they were driven from Galilee, and the zealot rebels and thousands of refugees arrived in Judea, which just created more political turmoil in Jerusalem. This group had already split, and now they were having to be put back together. So you basically had a bunch of Roman or Jewish generals fighting each other, which this is a split that was talked about there. So the confrontation between mainly the Sadducees and the Zealots was the problem there, and then there was violence that erupted between the Jewish groups. There was a lot of bloodshed over. So with the Edomites entering the city and fighting on the side of the Zealots, one of the Jewish leaders, this Amos ben Amos, was killed, and his faction suffered a bunch of casualties. And this Simon Bargoria commanded 15,000 troops, was then invited into Jerusalem by the Sadducees to stand against the Zealots, and quickly took control of much of the city. So there was fighting inside the city of Jerusalem, while all this stuff was going on, while the Romans were getting ready to siege. So there was a lot of bitter fighting between these two groups from 67 to 69 AD. And then there was a lull in the military operations due to a civil war and political turmoil back in Rome. So what had basically happened was Nero died, he was dead, and then there was 3 usurpers to the throne. And these 3 usurpers, this was about an 18-month period, they were all killed, but it was causing so much of a problem that Vespasian had to go back to Rome and clean the mess up in Rome. And then in 69 AD, he was actually appointed emperor after he had cleaned up the mess. But he wasn't able to go back to Jerusalem to finish the job. So his son Titus, who was now in command of the army, they besieged the city, and in 70 AD, Jerusalem fell. The first 2 walls of Jerusalem were breached within 3 weeks, but there was still a pretty decent standoff with the rebels or the Jews that prevented the army from breaking through the third and the thickest wall. So there was a 7-month siege during which the Zealots' infighting resulted in burning of the entire food supply of the city. They got mad at everybody, so they just burned everybody's food up. That was brilliant on their part, in my estimation. So this made the situation worse. And what did Zechariah prophesy that we talked about last week? That they were going to be eating each other. The neighbors were going to be eating the neighbors. Well, here's the reason they had to do this, because their leaders burned their food supply. So finally, the Romans succeeded in breaching the defenses in the summer of 70 AD. And then following the fall of Jerusalem, Titus left for Rome, leaving the 10th Legion there to defeat the remaining Jewish holdout. And the final campaign was in Masada in 73 and 74. There's been some talk on the news lately about Masada. That's where the Zealots held out up on top of the hill. So, you can read the history here of what happened and see that, that Zechariah was right on track. So I appreciate everybody's attention and comments today. Yep. We got that wall or that arch.
You wouldn't have any red, but well, I did.